Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603. Good Queen Bess, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth now seems to us not so much a figure of flesh and blood as a character in a mask, an icon of Englishness, a symbol of majesty. This was the woman who renounced her womanhood to become the epitome of a prince, a goddess-like figure presiding over a golden age in which England defied the power of Spain and embarked on the adventure of empire. Such is the myth. Well, maybe I'll read the biography. Born September 1533 at Greenwich, father Henry VIII, mother Anne Boleyn, never married, no children. She was succeeded on 1558. You can see when she's crowned. She's of the Royal House of Tudor. Style, Queen of England, France and Ireland, Defender of the Faith, and Church of England, and also of Ireland, on the earth, the supreme head. She died in 1603 at Richmond, and she's buried in Westminster Abbey. Such is the myth, and it is a myth to which Elizabeth herself contributed as a deliberate tool of policy. She had, as her father had had before her, a natural grasp of what her people expected of the man or woman who wore the crown. Elizabeth was above all the consummate politician, prudent and pragmatic, where her half-brother Edward and her half-sister Mary had been led by their consciences into unwise zealotry. The uncertainties and dangers of her childhood and youth made her cautious and wary, reluctant to commit herself to any one course of action, where indecision or ambiguity could be maintained to her advantage. These were qualities that were to serve her in a good stead throughout her 45-year reign, a period so identified with her personally that it is known as the Elizabethan age. There's a quote, "I will never be by violence constrained to do anything. I thank God that I am endued with such qualities that if I were turned out of my realm in my petticoat, I were able to live in any place in Christendom." Birth and education. From her birth, Elizabeth was a disappointment to her father, Henry VIII, for the simple reason of her sex, which made her, in his eyes, unfit to be his heir. Had he not discarded, at great trouble to himself and his realm, his first wife, because she could bear him nothing but a girl-child, Elizabeth's half-sister Mary? At first, Henry was happy that Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, had at least shown herself fertile, but when Anne went on to suffer a miscarriage and a stillbirth, Henry began to look elsewhere, and by 1536 his eye had settled on Jane Seymour. Anne's fate was sealed, and in May of that year she was executed on trumped-up charges of adultery and incest, treasonous acts on the part of a queen consort. Elizabeth was not quite 3 when her mother lost her head. Henry's marriage to Anne was declared void, and Elizabeth was thus legally illegitimate. When Jane Seymour, who became Henry's third wife, bore him a boy-child in 1537, Elizabeth's chances of succeeding to the throne became increasingly remote. The Act of Succession of 1544 declared that if Edward should die without issue, the crown would pass to Mary, and if only she died childless, would the succession pass to Elizabeth. Elizabeth was largely brought up at Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, although she did attend court on special occasions. She was not entirely excluded from her father's affections, and Henry's sixth wife, Catherine Parr, treated Elizabeth almost like her own daughter. The young princess, by all accounts, a serious girl, was provided with a number of excellent tutors, most notably the humanist scholar Roger Ascham, and mastered not only Latin and Greek, but also Italian, French, and Spanish. Ascham was impressed with his pupil. She hath obtained the excellency of learning, to understand, speak, and write, both wittily and with head, and fair with hand, as scarce one or two rare wits in both the universities have in many years reached unto. She was also exposed to the principles of English Protestantism, but her lack of enthusiasm for theology was an indication of her future pragmatism as far as religion was concerned. There is only one Jesus Christ, she was once reported as having said, and all the rest is a dispute over trifles. Perils of a Princess. After her father's death, Elizabeth moved into the household of Catherine Parr, and her new husband, Thomas Seymour. Seymour, a man of overweening ambition, apparently made advances to Elizabeth, and after the death of his wife in childbirth, proposed marriage. Elizabeth wisely prevaricated, as in January 1549 Seymour was charged with treason against Edward VI, and for plotting against his own brother, the Protector Somerset. Elizabeth was subjected to an intensive and humiliating interrogations, but gave nothing away that might incriminate her. Seymour was condemned to death. For the rest of Edward VI's short reign, Elizabeth, as a fellow Protestant, was in favour, but when Edward defied his father's act of succession, and named the Protestant lady Jane Grey as his successor, Elizabeth sided with her Catholic half-sister Mary, and was at Mary's side when she rode into London to claim the throne. This show of loyalty did not prevent the arrest of Elizabeth in January 1554 on suspicion of involvement in Sir Thomas Wyatt's rebellion. Wyatt and many other English Protestants objected to Queen Mary's proposed marriage to the Catholic Philip of Spain, and Elizabeth was the obvious focus of Protestant discontent. She was sent in tears to the Tower of London, while the captured rebels were tortured to extract evidence against her. Mary's advisers urged that Elizabeth go to the block, but Elizabeth survived. She spent a year under house arrest at Woodstock, where, on a window pane, she scratched the following motto: "Much suspected of me, nothing proved can be." Throughout the rest of Mary's short reign, Elizabeth kept a low profile, outwardly conforming to the re-established Catholic faith, and declaring her undying loyalty to the Queen. It was in such circumstances of suspicion and danger, as heads rolled and heretics burned, that Elizabeth first learned the necessity of presenting the right image. Elizabeth's accession. Mary had been desperate for a Catholic heir, but it is likely that her childbearing years were over by the time she married Philip at the age of 38. Certainly there was no issue from the match, and Mary could not persuade Parliament to alter her father's act of succession, which meant that the Protestant Elizabeth would succeed her. In the event, Elizabeth's succession on the 17th of November, 1558, was greeted with great rejoicing. The bells rang out from every church, and bonfires blazed across the land. The smoothness of Elizabeth's accession was ascribed to Sir William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh, who had been on Edward VI's Privy Council, and whom Elizabeth made her private secretary and principal secretary of state on becoming queen. He was to prove a tireless and loyal minister to Elizabeth until his death in 1598. "My lord," Elizabeth said to him in his gouty old age, "we make use of you not for your bad legs, but for your good head." Elizabeth was also blessed by other wise and experienced advisers, who, if not without the rivalries with each other, were creatures of the Queen, not of outside factions, and served her until they died. Her courtiers, on the other hand, came in and out of favour with dazzling rapidity, but she always made sure that she kept court politics firmly separated from the serious business of running the real world. The marriage question. Uppermost in everybody's mind was the question of who the 25-year-old queen should marry, for it was assumed by all that a monarch of the weaker sex would need a king to help her rule. The fact that Elizabeth never did wed has been a conundrum to historians, as it was a bafflement to her contemporaries. At the time, there were those who whispered she had some secret reasons, perhaps some hidden physical deformity she could not bear to let a husband see. More recently, some have speculated that she was not sexually attracted to men. Regarding this latter suggestion, one has only to think of her public flirtations with her various favourites, such as the Earl of Leicester and the Earl of Essex, and the occasional outbursts of jealousy. She was furious with Sir Walter Raleigh when he began an affair with one of her maids of honour, to have little doubt as to her sexual orientation and the strength of her feelings. Her attachment to Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was the most durable of her affections. It has been suggested that she would have married him had not the council refused to sanction it, partly because Leicester's father, the Duke of Northumberland, had been the power behind the treasonous plot to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne, and partly because Leicester was, in the words of Spanish ambassador, a light and greedy man. Also hanging over Leicester was the death of his first wife, Amy Robsart, in suspicious circumstances. Romantics like to believe that Elizabeth, unable to marry the man she loved, refused to marry at all. But there is probably a more statesmanlike reason behind Elizabeth's maintenance of her single state. She had seen the difficulties that a foreign marriage had caused the half-sister Mary, drawing her into foreign wars that were deeply unpopular with her own people. And whereas Mary was by temperament anxious to be guided, indeed dominated, by a strong male hand, Elizabeth showed no such inclination, once telling Leicester, when he had overstepped the mark on some matter, "God's death, my lord, I will have here, but one mistress and no master." The alternative to a foreign match was to marry one of the leading nobles of the land, such as Leicester. But the obvious danger here was that the Queen would thus be seen showing favour to one particular family, thereby creating factionalism and strife among the aristocracy. Not that Queen Elizabeth did not know how to play one faction off against the other, but she was never going to permit any one group to gain the upper hand. Thus, it was not necessarily by default that Elizabeth cultivated the image of the Virgin Queen. Whether she actually remained Virgo intacta is unknown, but to her people she presented herself as the woman who was wed not to one man, but to her whole realm. And when the threat of foreign invasion arose, her virginity, always represented as a jewel in Renaissance iconography, became a symbol of the inviolability of England and the precious stone set in a silver sea, as one of her more effective propagandists put it. When she smiled, it was pure sunshine that everyone did choose to bask in, if they could, but anon came a storm from a sudden gathering of clouds, and the thunder fell in wondrous manner on all alike. Sir John Harington, and so forth. Elizabeth's via media. "I would not open windows into men's souls," Elizabeth famously declared, and broadly speaking, her religious policy aimed to enforce outward conformity to Protestantism, while not inquiring too closely as to her subjects' privately held beliefs. Elizabeth steered a middle way, the famous via media, between the ardent and absolutist Catholicism of Mary and her Habsburg relatives on the one hand, and the levelling theocrats of Calvinism on the other. It was under Elizabeth that the modern character of the Church of England, still to this day in England the established church, began to take shape. In 1559, the year after Elizabeth's succession, Parliament passed the Act of Uniformity, which made the use of Protestant Book of Common Prayer compulsory, and the Act of supremacy, which required all public officials to swear an oath recognizing Elizabeth as a supreme governor of the Church of England, a more modest title than that claimed by her father, who had been supreme head. The doctrine of the Church of England was summed up in the 39 Articles finally agreed in 1571, which blend, sometimes ambiguously, both Catholic and Protestant beliefs and practices. Elizabeth did not share her half-sister's inclination to burn those with whom she disagreed on theological matters, but she had no compunction in sending traitors to their deaths. The 200 to 300 English martyrs remembered by the Roman Catholic Church from Elizabeth's reign were not so much the victims of religious intolerance. Only 4 men were burnt for heresy under Elizabeth, and they were all Anabaptists, as of other European power politics. The fate was sealed when in 1570 Pope Pius V, a more uncompromising pontiff than his predecessor, issued a bull excommunicating Elizabeth and declaring her to be deprived of her pretended title to the aforesaid crown, and of all lordship, dignity, and privilege whatsoever. He thus declared open season on the English Queen, granting permission to her own Catholic subjects and the Catholic powers of Europe to seek her overthrow. The trouble with Mary. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, the rightful Queen of England was Mary, Queen of Scots, granddaughter of Henry VII, whose daughter, Margaret, had married James IV of Scotland. Mary's Catholicism was not the taste of her subjects, but in the end it was the rivalries between the Scottish nobles and not religion that drove Mary from her throne, forcing her to seek the protection of her cousin Elizabeth in England. It was not long after Mary's arrival in England, in 1568, that the plots against Elizabeth began, and there seems little doubt that Mary was involved in most of them, in one way or another. In 1569 there was the rebellion of the Northern Earls. It was apparently this that encouraged the Pope to issue his bull of excommunication against Elizabeth, and in 1571 an international conspiracy called the Ridolfi Plot was exposed. Across Europe the religious divide became more and more polarized, following the 1572 St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of Protestants in France and the outbreak of a Protestant revolt against Spanish rule in the Netherlands. The Jesuits were infiltrating clandestine missionaries into England, and to Elizabeth and her council these priests appeared no less than hostile agents of a foreign power. Although Elizabeth herself gave a convincing display of sang-froid in the face of danger, the atmosphere of suspicion around her increased. The Queen resisted all attempts by her advisers to persuade her to rid herself of the viper in the midst until in 1586 government spies found conclusive evidence of Mary's involvement in the Babington Plot, another conspiracy against Elizabeth's life. Although Mary was tried and found guilty, Elizabeth prevaricated for 3 months before signing her cousin's death warrant. After the execution, she gave a display of grief, fury, and regret, declaring that she had never intended the sentence to be carried out. The threat from Spain. The death of Mary did not put an end to the danger for Protestant England. Elizabeth was as reluctant as her father, Henry VII, to become involved in foreign wars, partly on grounds of the expense, and had mostly succeeded in playing off the 2 great European powers, France and Spain, against each other. But in 1585 she had reluctantly agreed to give military support to the Dutch revolt against Spain, and this, combined with the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the attacks by English privateers on Spanish shipping returning from the New World, provoked Philip II of Spain into a massive retaliatory action intended to clear England of Protestantism once and for all. In the summer of 1588, the Armada, a great fleet of some 130 ships under the Duke of Medina Sidonia, set out from Lisbon. The plan was to sail up the English Channel, pick up a Spanish army from Flanders under the Duke of Parma, and then cross to England. But as the Spanish fleet made its way up the Channel, it was harried by the faster and more maneuverable ships of the English navy. Eventually the Spanish fleet anchored off Calais, only to be dispersed until the night by the English fireships. Driven out to sea, the Spanish suffered much loss of life in an engagement of Gravelines. Meanwhile, England prepared for invasion. When the Spanish fleet was first sighted off Cornwall, beacon fires were lit on hilltops across the kingdom. Elizabeth herself rode out to address her troops at Tilbury on the Thames estuary. She rose to the occasion magnificently with a speech that rings down through the centuries. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I think I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain, or any other prince of Europe, should dare to invade the borders of my realm, to which, rather than any dishonour shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field." As it turned out, as the southerly winds gained strength, the cumbersome Spanish ships found it impossible to make headway back towards Calais. Pursued by the English fleet, the Spaniards were forced to sail north in worsening conditions. When they eventually limped home, they had lost dozens of ships on the rocky coast of Scotland and Ireland, and thousands of men had perished. In the end, it was the weather that proved decisive, but the failure of the Armada enormously enhanced the prestige of England and its queen. The final years. By now the myth of Elizabeth the Magnificent was securely established, carefully cultivated by the Queen herself. She turned her public appearances into living theatre, and showed herself across the land in lavish royal progresses, largely paid for by her wealthy hosts, demanding and receiving the love of her people. The poet Edmund Spenser made her the central figure in his allegorical epic, The Faerie Queen. Sir Walter Raleigh described her, at the age of 58, as riding like Alexander, hunting like Diana, walking like Venus, while the official royal portraits displayed a richly dressed and fabulously bejeweled creature staring out through an inscrutable white mask. But the reality of Elizabeth's last years did not match the myth. Poor economic conditions and bad harvests led to considerable suffering, and Parliament proved increasingly reluctant to do the Queen's bidding. The Tudor project to settle Ireland and end the hegemony of the Catholic Gaels began under Mary and continued under Elizabeth, led to a succession of rebellions with some support from the Catholic powers of Europe. The last of these rebellions in Elizabeth's reign, headed by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, led to the downfall of Elizabeth's last favourite, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, a strutting turkey-cock with more courage than sense. Essex vowed to defeat Tyrone, but instead, after experiencing some minor reversals, made a private truce with the rebel Earl in September 1599. Elizabeth was furious, and even more so when, against her orders, Essex returned to England. Continuing with his folly, he attempted to raise an armed rebellion in London, but it was a forlorn hope, and the Queen refused even to interrupt her dinner when she heard the news. He was found guilty of treason and executed in 1601. Apparently undaunted by her favourite's treachery and despite deteriorating health, Elizabeth continued to assert herself as Queen of England. When Robert Cecil, who had taken over the position of most trusted adviser from his father, Lord Burleigh, had told the poorly Queen she must go to bed, she responded, "Must? Is must a word to be used to princes? Little man, thy father, if thy had been alive, durst not have used that word? Just as earlier in her reign, Elizabeth had proved coy about her marital intentions, so in her later years she avoided the question of her successor. This may have been calculated, as a nominated successor would encourage the growth of factions and create an alternative center of power. It may have been simple vanity, a reluctance to allow for the possibility that any other ruler of England could match her in the people's affections. At the end of November 1601, with little more than a year still to live, she gave Parliament the benefit of one of her finest pieces of oratory, the so-called Golden Speech. Although God hath raised me high, yet this I count the glory of my crown, that I have reigned with your loves. And though you have had, and may have many mightier and wiser princes sitting in this seat, yet you have never had, nor shall have, any that will love you better. It was brilliant touches such as this that made the English, in the more uncertain times of her Stuart successors, recall with fondness what became known as Good Queen Bess's golden times. Earlier English monarchs had regarded England as their possession and their plaything. For Elizabeth, or so it appeared to her people, her sense of obligation to her country was at the core of her being. And there's a little thing on Virginia which I'm going to read. It was in honor of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, that in 1584 Sir Walter Raleigh gave the name Virginia to the whole area of the east coast of North America, explored by his expedition. Thus, the first Virginia settlement, which Raleigh unsuccessfully attempted to establish between 1584 and 1589, was actually in what is now North Carolina, on Roanoke Island. It was not until 1607, in the reign of Elizabeth's successor, James I, that the first permanent English settlements was founded in North America, at Jamestown, in the modern state of Virginia. A map, and then there's a picture here.